Welcome to Subversive Clarity. I'm Simon Esler. I have spent years studying the war on children, also known as the war on innocence. I felt strongly about starting this series with a full episode focused on the kids and with a case study that deeply informs us about the systemic ways we are failing to honor and protect our children and their innocence. With the Epstein files opening eyes around the world to the reality of normalized child abuse in the halls of power, it's important to bring our situational awareness home to see how this war on children is manifest locally. While I do advocate for using the Epstein files as a resource for awakening the masses to that which has remained hidden, I think it's essential not to let the outrage machine embedded in our algorithms distract us from what's happening in our own backyards. As the indomitable Boone Cutler always emphasized, you have to focus on your 30-meter target. If we are all focused on 5,000-meter targets, the takedown of elites that are not an existential threat to the children in our own families and communities, then we are potentially failing the very children we are uniquely positioned to help. Monique, my guest today, has been focused explicitly on that mission, using the growing awareness of systemic, normalized child abuse as a call to action in her own community. Today, Monique and I are collaborating on a particular scandal that few have heard of, the scope of which has yet to be properly reported on. The Robert Land Academy military-style boys' school is a perfect case study in the institutionalization of child abuse and the laws that enable it. Boys at the school were outright tortured, sexually, physically, and psychologically. Force-fed detergent and their own vomit, beaten, bruised, and bloody, stripped naked in front of teachers in the freezing cold, raped and threatened. The list goes on. Perhaps more shocking is that this school had the backing of the community's most powerful institutions and individuals, from the Canadian Armed Forces to the local police, and even conservative leadership on the board. Very dark questions remain as to how a school that used torture as a way to help troubled boys was allowed to operate for over half a century, only closing down in 2025. Even as the boys begged their parents for help, the school gaslit the parents, using preemptive letters and phone calls to seed fake narratives, accusing the boys of avoiding accountability and discipline with lies. Sadly, the world is now filled with broken men, who, as boys, were sent into this hellhole. Many have committed suicide or succumbed to drug abuse and alcoholism. Even worse, it's likely that some have become abusers themselves. Fortunately, a group of remaining survivors are on the path to exposing this, with active lawsuits building proper momentum and a recent investigation being announced. I am working to get at least one of the survivors on this show as soon as I can. Thank you for joining me on Subversive Clarity. I hope this episode moves you to be of service to the kiddos. Thank you. Thank you for joining me, Monique. If you want to just start off, give people a sense of who you are, what kind of mission you're on right now, so that people can have some context before we get into anything deeper.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much, Simon, for having me. I really appreciate you giving me a platform to speak. So I am a mom of two girls, recently became a grandmother, and I've been an activist and kind of citizen journalist for the past 6 years, I guess now. And my organization, Moms Resist, formed about 4 years ago. This was just, during the COVID era, when we saw the kids were being affected by lockdowns, mandates, medical intervention. And, as mothers, we could see that children were suffering psychologically, developmentally, emotionally. And we as mothers wanted to put a stop to the government overreach that was occurring and start really governing over our children and what was best for them. A lot of children suffered through that time. Suicide went up, child abuse, neglect. A lot of parents were even, relapsing that had been on, the right path for quite some time. So a lot of, you know, children were in hospitals. I spoke to a lot of nurses at that time, Simon, as you know, and the one of the nurses, she worked at the hospital in Barrie, RVH, said that they saw a drastic increase in children trying to kill themselves. Um, and so we as parents saw something very concerning, and that's how Moms Resist was formed. So we took a few initiatives at that time. We did a couple of marches in Toronto, just vigils, holding candles, singing Amazing Grace, with affected children. And that's kind of a little bit of background about how we started. Recently, Moms Resist saw, uh, this this was really in the recent, like in light of the recent release of the Epstein files, that we now wanted to kind of shift gears. Although it's always been about defending and protecting children, uh, we now are focused on ending child exploitation and child trafficking, which is a huge issue, not only globally, it's a foreign and it's a domestic issue. It's happening here in our own backyard, in our communities. And having really looked into these issues and being immersed in this, I don't think Canadians are aware of how massive of a problem this is in our country, how lax our laws are against child sexual predators, how there's strict criteria around the Amber Alert system and how that is issued, how child sex predators are being released into neighborhoods constantly around parks, schools, children, and the reoffend rate is 1 in 4. So majority of these people are very high risk and will reoffend. So our children are in danger. There are over 600 registered sex offenders in Hamilton, Ontario, where a judge just ruled that making the National Sex Offender Registry public would be unconstitutional. Therefore, protecting the privacy of these people who commit these heinous crimes over the children who these crimes were committed against and the potential future victims, which are innocent.
Okay, so we have this issue, it looks like in Canada, where this is something I've been tracking in my own research that children aren't really protected through the lens of parental rights at all. So I know that there's no laws in Canada that have anything to do with parental rights, which
Right.
personally I've seen as a huge gap, because at the same time, there's this framing of children as sovereign individuals, as political entities. So the whole children's rights framing in our legal system is, on the one hand, very shaky because it's often being used to actually separate children from the family. And then on the other hand, we have laws that seem to be, I guess, focused on what they would call restorative justice. That's the claim, at least, is that when punishments are too harsh, then the offender doesn't, they don't actually get better. And so they've taken this angle as an opportunity to now be much lighter in their sentencing for sex offenders and all sorts of criminals, to be honest.
Mhm.
Um, what do you understand? the judge's reasoning to be in the Hamilton case when it comes to protecting the rights of child sex, offenders?
So, to my knowledge, Simon, I think this case was in regards to a certain specific individual. So I guess in the judge's eyes, he wasn't high risk, and there are some that aren't, that they shouldn't be put on this sex offender registry, that could potentially be made public, which is something that is being considered right now, right? So there is a member of parliament by the name of Fred Davies, who is the one that is supporting the petition. So that is my understanding of it. However, uh, you know, we need to consider the protection of children, all children, and these crimes that are being committed, no matter how big or small a judge thinks, um, it destroys a child. It destroys childhoods. And we cannot continue to allow this to happen, because traumatized children become traumatized adults. It is something that remains with you, and it takes immense healing to recover from the damage it causes to a child.
So I've looked a little bit into this debate, and there seems to be tension between making the sex offender registry totally public versus customizing it for certain levels of offenders. So in your communications with, MPs, and in your push, what is the framework that you think we should be fighting for here? Is it something that should be more broad, or is it a system that will pick a certain level of offender?
No, I personally believe every offender should be on that list. Um, and, this is my opinion, and some might disagree with me. Um, but I think anybody who is able to commit an offense against a child should be, um, people should be made aware of that, right? And I don't think that they should just be able to walk in our societies without, us being made aware of that. So we as parents can protect our children. Like you just said earlier, it's like parental rights are being stripped away. And, it's like, when are we going to be able to, we birth these children, we raise these children, we love these children. We need to be able to protect them if our government is not. And, that's our right. So we are asking for the government to consider this. And in my honest opinion, Simon, I can't imagine that there's really any MP or member of government that wouldn't agree with protecting children over sexual predators. I have to ask that question as to, what reason would you have to not protect children and to protect the sexual predator? And the only answer I can come up with is that they they agree with with protecting child predators, right?
I think too, one of the important backdrops to identify here is that child sexual abuse, child sex trafficking, especially online, is on the rise. I mean, this is something that is increasing in Canada. There is a struggle to keep up with it. I know that law enforcement is really struggling with, abusive scenarios online, that there's online cults that have been recruiting children into horrible things, and that they're struggling to keep up with it. Um, but it is so important, I think, to recognize that this is a problem that is rising as judges like this are more focused on, defending the sex offender themselves. So that's the sort of context. I think in Canada, we've had this struggle for many years now. Like you said, COVID, I think, brought a lot of this out. I personally, I remember going to the 1 Million March for Children protest,
Mhm.
And I made a short documentary on this because when I went there, the counter protesters were all active Marxists. And so for me, it was helpful for the public to understand that the counter protest was coming from an actual communist Marxist ideological stance. But what was interesting there was that it was Christians and Muslims, families of different faiths coming together to demand changes to the curricula, which is another whole backdrop to all this, is that we have school curricula that is increasingly sexualized. And I think, all of this context matters because I think, we're going to get into the story of the Robert Land Academy briefly, but I really want to set up this backdrop here because we also have this struggle with the schools, not only increasing the sexual nature of curricula, but at the same time, looking to give the school more power over the child and taking away the parental rights. So there's been a struggle in a number of provinces when it comes to transitioning children, socially transitioning children. There's even some cases of schools helping to medically transition children and wanting a precedent that allows them to hide that process from the parents. And, I think all of this is really important context because the way that things are moving in Canada, they're using the idea of children's rights to give the children more over to the state and further away from parental guidance. And I think,
Well, they
you know,
sorry, yeah.
yeah,
They think children are at like they're giving decision making
yeah,
um to children that when it comes to things that should be decided on as adults, right? Like, and it's also we're seeing normalization of sexualization of children and then the desensitization of the our society really. And so when it comes to providing sexually explicit content or material to a minor, it is illegal under the criminal code under section 171.1 in the criminal code. However, there is a gray area that if it's being provided as educational purposes and falls under the curriculum, then it's not criminal. But a lot of what you just said is that we are seeing that there's been some, things that have slipped through. And, there's been definitely questions raised. And there's even been an organization that apologized for the pamphlets that they were giving out in schools after backlash from the parents. So yes, there are multi layers to this issue, Simon. I would 100% agree with you. And again, we need to now, as parents, empower parents to take our power back and govern over our children, right? Like we decide what is best for our children, not our government, not teachers, not the schools. We, the parents, decide what is best for our children.
this seems to be at the heart of the struggle in Canada right now. There is this, it's almost a philosophical change in the way that they're viewing children. So you have what they call the mature minor doctrine, right? And this is a big sort of foundational legal angle that is often used to separate child from parents. And the mature minor doctrine, really, there's no age range at all. And it claims that if a child is deemed to understand the consequences of something by an expert, by someone outside the family, then they can do things like medically transition. They can get vaccines without the parents. I recently found out that it's standard at places like Sick Kids Hospital to cut off parental access to medical records once a child turns 13, and you have to fill out all these forms to get access to that. Um, I think it's important for people to understand that the ideological foundation to all of this, it's Marxist in the sense that it frames the family as a site where oppression is propagated, right? There's this old communist idea that the family unit is where oppression is duplicated and passed on the generations. And we have a lot of government officials that are deeply steeped in this Marxist idea of family, which is the justification they use, for example, with transitioning children, is that the parents, if they're not on board with sex changes for children are bigots, and therefore the family is a site for bigotry, and then the children need to be rescued from the family's bigotry. So this framing, this is all embedded throughout the legal system in Canada, in our schools, in lots of different areas. It's the position of the Canadian Pediatric Society, very strongly in a lot of ways. So I think it is really important to understand that we are at the heart of this philosophical struggle in Canada, where there is a rejection of the idea that children cannot make decisions for themselves when it comes to long-term implications. And I think this really plays into a lot of what we're going to get into today, because I think if we continue along this path of presuming that children can make life impacting decisions and have the power to do this, then they're going to continue to be put in these scenarios where abuse is almost automatically going to happen.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, it's frightening, Simon. It's actually quite frightening. If you look at the evolution of this and how they've kind of been chipping away at this, um, it's happening at quite a rapid pace. And will we one day forever lose control of our children and have no rights over them? Like, because that's the direction that we're heading in. And I think people need to wake up. They really need to wake up. And I hope to God that what we're doing with Save Our Children right now across North America is waking people up. And there's so many people that are just, they're not backing down this time, not when it comes to what's been recently released, and that what our worst fears that we've known and you've known for a very long time have come into the light. And now the truth is undeniable about how deeply embedded child trafficking is in the people who rule us, who govern us, the elitists, the richest people in the world, politicians. Like it's frightening. And here we are having to fund these things that they're a part of. I was just watching last night. I spent 4 hours watching the congressional hearing with Bill Clinton, and very eye-opening to see. Like, he was talking about flying on the plane with Epstein, Ghislaine, Kevin Spacey, Naomi Campbell, the Rothschilds, going to the King of Morocco's wedding with the people I just mentioned on board the plane. And anytime they ask Bill Clinton, and this is how they get around this, if there was anything he ever saw when it came to underage children or any conversations, he just keeps saying, not to my recollection.
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
repeated and repeated and repeated. And I think people need to be very um, outraged right now that I don't see it, because I think they just they really like we talked about earlier about the truth being so hard, right? It's not easy. The truth is not easy. But once the truth is out, then we can, you know, acknowledge it and change things. But we know our own Trudeau was in there. Mark Carney is in there 69 times, was with Ghislaine Maxwell and photographed with her after Jeffrey Epstein was already convicted of child luring in 2008. So we, the people, deserve to ask questions and have answers to our questions. And just like they're doing in the US, we don't want files. We've got the files now. We want the trials, right? We want investigations.
There's a couple pieces here that I think are really, really important. Number one is this idea of elites that are what I would call morally inverted, right? So if we look at just the trajectory of Western society, there was always this idea of childhood innocence and of childhood innocence being protected and defended, and the protection of childhood innocence as a norm that is understood within society And so now the Epstein files has helped people get insight into the idea of leaders who are presented one way, but inside they are morally inverted. They function in a way that is hard for us to connect with because these are people who see the destruction of a child's innocence as something normal, that's normalized for them. They see the power that they get through destroying a child's innocence as something that was a ritual part of their lives. And I think this this backdrop is really important for people to grasp because it really lends itself to what's going on with the the Robert Land Academy case, which we can get into. I think people in positions of power that seek to destroy a child's innocence, this is a hard thing for people to comprehend, to really take in deeply. And I think I'm grateful for the Epstein files really making this more understandable for people. I think it's a really good wake up call. But I think translating that into things that are more close to home is tricky for people. So I guess there's
That's
there's that piece.
exactly, yeah, that's exactly what Moms Resist is trying to do.
Yeah.
Because we want to make this relative to what's happening in our own backyard, in our own country. Because, yes, the Epstein papers was a revelation of what's taking place. But then obviously, I mean, they're all over the world, Prince Andrew, and others that are mentioned in there. But it's also very relative to here and what's happening here. And that's what we're trying to do is create awareness and expose the things that are happening here in Canada that people may not be aware of, right?
Well, the other piece of this that I think is really, really important is the pattern of parents giving up their parental authority, giving away their parental authority, giving away the idea that they are the ones that best understand their children, that they are the ones most positioned to defend their children based on the fact that they know them. They know them the best. They know them the most intimately. And I think, you look at Jeffrey Epstein. There's a number of files that show that there were parents who gave their children up to Epstein, who allowed access to their children. And so this pattern of parents failing in this way and not understanding their role, I think this is really important to see in tandem with this pattern of elites being exposed as totally morally inverted individuals. So with all of that backdrop, why don't we jump now into the Robert Land Academy scandal? Give me a sense of like how you found out about this and what you initially understood when you discovered it.
Hmm. So actually hasn't been too long, to be honest with you. So when I agreed to do the Save Our Children March and initiate it first here in Canada, I started getting connected to a bunch of people just to look for people who could speak at the event. Um, and I have a dear friend named Stefanos Karatopoulos, who I've known for many years, but we never discussed this. And we started, so I was on their show, Freedom Report, and then we started, he started talking about Robert Land. And I was like, my cousin went to Robert Land Academy. And then it all just kind of went from there. Stefanos spoke at our event on March 7th. He's a survivor of Robert Land Academy who experienced the most horrible, horrific abuses to him at 11, starting at 11 years old. He was there from 1981 to 1983. And he's just been such an advocate. The school closed down last year. And since that, he's just been fighting along with the other boys who are survivors. And they have formed this brotherhood, right? Because of what they experienced and had to endure. And through their advocacy, they are healing and also exposing. And what happened as well is there's many lawsuits right now against the teachers and the school and other um, and others as well. So Robert Land was open for half a century, and the abuses committed over that time. Um, there's a lot of different involvement in the school, and it's a very dark story. There was even some government officials that were affiliated with the school. Tim Hudak sat on the board. Robert Land Academy awarded Christine Elliott an award. Military, some police are involved. And what's really frightening about Robert Land Academy is most of the men that taught there were not licensed teachers and were convicted criminals. So how did this happen in Canada? How was this allowed to happen in Canada? Right. And the reason for that, well, this, I believe, was an experiment, and Stefanos will say that this was definitely an experiment. We don't have in Canada any law or, mandate that teachers or staff of private schools have criminal background checks. So these convicted criminals got to teach at this school, and also it's not a requirement that teachers be licensed. So that's how they got away with it. But they also got away with it with support of other, entities and individuals and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I did a lot of digging into this, and it's really frightening how dark and how sort of tangled this web is. I watched a 1980s documentary from CBC that was promoting. It was when the school was only 3 years old, and it was promoting it as a new military style school for young boys and normalizing what we today would already think was pretty dark. So, for example, the CBC journalist was asking them about some of the rules they were reading, and one of the worst offenses was cowardice. And then in brackets, it said running away. And it had to do with any of the boys who tried to run away from this school, which I guess was really common. And it was one of the things they seemed to want the boys to be most afraid of, that if you try to run away from this school, that you're going to get the worst punishment of all. And the way they were covering this was horrifying. Now, there are two boys who died by being hit by a train, who had run
They,
away from the school. What do you know
yeah,
about that particular story?
yeah, they ran away. And many of the boys ran away, Simon. So many of the boys would try and run away. And I'll get to your cowardice, remark there in a minute. But these two boys were the age of 14 and 15 years old, and they laid down on the railroad tracks and committed suicide. There's different stories that, oh, they tripped, or one of the boys had it was on medication and maybe was drowsy. No, many of these kids, as they got older, tried to commit suicide. There was another boy that Stefanos had to take down twice. Once he tried to hang himself with a tie, and he had to resuscitate him at 11 years old. He had to resuscitate him. And the other time he attempted suicide, he did it with a bootlace. But he got him down in time that he didn't have to resuscitate him. I want to point out that one of the brothers whose brother died, who committed suicide on the tracks, was then later sent to that school after his brother's death. He said it plummeted their family into grief and his dad into alcoholism, and he sent his other son to the school, which is completely like, make it make sense. I can't believe it. But the two boys' names who committed suicide were put on a bench inside of the school. And when kids would walk past it with these teachers, they would say, "This is what happens to you if you try to run away," or, these cowards had this happen to them. And this poor brother of the individual who passed away, experienced just a whole lot of shame, abuse, just horror. And, you know, it's devastating to even believe that this could have occurred in our backyard. I don't know where I'm in like GTA, and it's just about 45 minutes here from me.
Yeah, yeah, same with me. I'm
I
in West
went
End
I
Toronto.
went I went to Robert Land when my cousin was there. At the end of the year, they would allow the families to come, and they would do like an end of year kind of celebration. They would march, they would have the band, that sort of thing. But parents were very rarely ever allowed to visit that school. And the boys didn't get to go home very often either. Like it was very short, like maybe over Christmas they got like some time. But when they coerced the parents or prepared the parents to say that your boys are going to tell you things about the school, but they're just homesick, right? Or they've never received this kind of discipline that's required, right? And so when the boys would tell their parents, they would dismiss them most of the time. Their letters back home that were sent back home to their parents were always monitored as well. Every single letter was read before it went out.
I did come across that part, and I think that that ties back into part of what I was talking about earlier, that a bigger part of this pattern is parents who give up their authority over their children, who trusted that the teachers and officials at this school knew their child better than they did. And so you had all these parents ignoring their children, their child crying for help, begging to stay home. Um, I think that's a big part of this pattern here, that one of the things that needs to change is that parents need to stand in their parental authority, stand in their wisdom as parents, that they know their child the best. And I think this story points to a lot of families that were struggling with behavioral issues with their boys. Fine, but then what they did was they completely sacrificed their parental authority. And I know that when it comes to the story of the kids who died on the train tracks, they even obtained photos of the children's severed legs from the train tracks. The officials at the school managed to get from the police the crime scene photos of these boys' severed legs and showed those to the kids at the school. Like you said, just in the same way that they put their names on the bench, they actually had access to the police photos. And one of the witnesses explained that they would show them the severed legs of these boys as a threat. So, this does tie deeply into things like the Epstein files, like I was saying, because you have people who are completely morally inverted. They're not like us. These are not people who are like us in any way. They don't operate like us. The way they view children and the world is it's alien to us. And again, I think that's one of the things that is hard for people to really grasp, is that you're dealing with individuals that don't function like us, but that are able to put on a facade that they do. And this school seems to have been filled with these people. The one of the founders, he was caught in the scandal, the military scandal, where he was running a unit that ended up torturing a boy to death. And he actually went away for a year. And then I think it was only a few years after he was convicted and then released is when he was hired at the Robert Land Academy.
Yep. You're
So,
referring to the Somalia.
yes, yes, the Somali scandal.
Yes. Yeah. And I'll also say, Simon, that I think about six of those convicted criminals that you've seen there are teaching still at other private schools in Fort Erie.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, again, I got to do, we're trying. We're trying to
Well,
expose this. We're hopefully going to create more initiatives that will bring people to, um, take action in peaceful and respectful ways, but with authority, right? And the time is now. Enough is enough, right? I think like it's now or never, in my opinion.
no, absolutely. I think this is the we have to use stories like this as momentum to get the laws in place that are necessary to protect children. And the fact that these teachers are still teaching, this there's lots of different patterns like this across our society. One story that this really sort of has me reflecting on is, the teacher at Oakville Trafalgar High School who showed up with the oversized breasts. This is my high school that I went to. Um,
Wow.
so this is another example. So this man, he showed up and he was obviously, I don't know, to me, someone who had autogynephilia, someone who was playing out a personal fetish. But the crazy part is that after that whole scandal blew up and after the school tried to defend his human rights, right, the idea that his gender expression and his gender identity are human rights and they needed to be defended, that was the position of the Halton School Board at the time. But after this scandal blew up, he was transferred to another school. He's teaching there now, but he's dropped the female identity and suddenly he's a man again. Um, this should deeply disturb so many parents. To me, it's another example of the holes in all of this, where you can be someone who is playing out a sexual fetish or who is, behaving in a way that is obviously damaging to children, obviously not conducive to any kind of learning environment, but then they are able to just slide around in the system and be protected. And I think that's what we're looking at with the Robert Land Academy. The scandal's so large. So now we have this problem. You have survivors, right? You have people who are speaking up, but you also potentially have hundreds of victims who are gone now, who have, like you said, committed suicide, who were not able to live long, healthy lives, who had became deeply damaged men, and we don't know what they did with that damage. Now it's lost, right? So many of them are just lost in the world now, and their stories will not be heard. So there is I think, a bigger call to justice here. And I think it's important that people really get the scope of this, that this isn't just a few corrupt teachers who abused a few boys when they had moments where they could get away with it. This was systemically in the school. This was their approach. One of the survivors, he described it as completely breaking you down to then build you up from scratch. And when I read that, you know, that's the techniques that were used in MK Ultra.
Mhm.
And one of the craziest things, MK Ultra, it began in Canada. It actually began in Montreal. Its origins are there. Now, MK Ultra was all about, torturing and, trying to essentially erase the individual so they could be built up from scratch. And they used techniques that were obviously more sophisticated. But here's the craziest part, is that the MK Ultra programs had more oversight than the Robert Land Academy did. I find that to be absolutely shocking, that this
Yeah.
horrifying government program that literally was mandated to torture people until they could be reprogrammed, that had more moral and ethical oversight than Robert Land Academy, which, as you said, we have conservative representatives who were on the board of Robert Land. You had coordination with police. There was a military cadet program that was connected to Robert Land, which they didn't drop until the scandals came out. But again, why is the Canadian military engaging with this school? It's so much like Epstein, because they're asking us to presume that all these people involved had no idea. And it just
Mhm.
doesn't seem possible to me.
Mhm. No. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head, Simon. It's too much happened, for people to just claim like, I didn't know. I didn't know. Just like Bill Clinton sat in that congressional hearing yesterday and
Yeah.
said, I have no recollection. Like, enough with the bullshit. I'm sorry, but it's like we now need to stand and be their voice and demand accountability and do not back down until we have the answers as to how this was allowed to happen for so long, right? How did they get away with this for so long? How was it not investigated after these two boys died, or the multiple suicide attempts, or the time that the boy tried to drink bleach and an ambulance came? How did this not get out? Because somebody or something or multiple things were protecting it, right? So, and That's the only plausible explanation. And unless there is people who actually want to sit down and, unless there is an actual trial, and the boys will say that are fighting this, they don't want lawsuits. They want investigations. Yes, this is how they're going to start, you know, the process and like the exposure and everything, but the money means nothing to them. They want justice. They want justice and they deserve justice because what happened to these children not only destroyed their childhoods, but it destroyed their adult lives. And as a survivor myself, I know how that happens, right? It really just it just destroys you. It really just you completely take away the innocence of a child, of the life that the child is supposed to experience. And because of that, and that loss, it carries you through to adulthood as a person with deep trauma. And it's very hard to recover from that.
I think it's important to point out ideologically what kind of sharks are circling, the children right now. Eh, because I know that there are academics now in Canada who are pushing the notion that childhood innocence is a social construct.
Oh my God.
And we've heard that language before, right? So or there's the idea of the child adult binary, and that the child adult binary is socially constructed. So, you're looking at the use of children's rights. Again, I think children's rights is one of the areas where Canada is in a lot of danger in terms of the way that it deals with its children. And I think um, it's completely lacking in our society. When you look over the Robert Land Academy case, there's so much failure in so many areas of our society. And I'd like to get a little bit more granular with some of the stories that you've heard of, because when I was going through this, I found a couple articles by the Walrus, and some exposés by the CBC. But then I could tell that there were huge gaps in victims' stories. Some of them have made it to the public. So, for example, there's a young man whose both his legs were broken
Yeah.
by one of the teachers there. That one actually got into the legal system, and yet the judge at the time ruled this as a minor abuse or something along those lines. And the guy was essentially allowed to go back to teaching after he broke both this child's legs. He got an infection. As an adult, he's still hobbling around today because of the
Mhm.
infection he got from his broken leg that they did not get him treatment for until it was too
Yeah.
late to avoid that kind of damage. So, there's a lot of stories like this. And just a moment ago, you had a story of someone who drank bleach. What are some of the stories that you've heard in connecting with survivors that maybe haven't made it out into the public in this larger way?
Mhm. I've heard of sexual abuse against the kids. And I'm going to respect the survivors that I've spoken to and their stories. But what I can, I'll talk to what I can talk about that I know is okay for me to talk about. Um, so one of the things that these kids were forced to do would be to run around for hours, sometimes naked in the cold with a 45-pound backpack on them. And then they'd also be forced to dig graves. Like one person told me they had to do it with a spoon. Okay, a spoon. And then they'd have to lie in the grave, be spit on, thrown dirt on. If, punishments were, they would have to strip naked and they would be hit with like a paddle. Um, and they would have to do push-ups until the point they vomited, and then they would be forced to eat their own vomit. Um, there's one boy that actually they have a Polaroid picture of he had to pull his pants down and they beat him so severely with that his black and blue um And he ran into the boys' room and said, "Please take a photo of me." And they had a Polaroid camera, and so they took a photo, and they still have this Polaroid picture. And you know, Simon, I could go on and on and on. There's a lot. They were forced to shower naked in front of each other. There was no later on there was like separation with, like walls and stalls, but they were, young boys that were just, I mean, exploited and abused and physically abused and sexually abused. And the sexual abuse is horrible, that the things that they were forced to do. And as I can tell stories that I know I can tell, as survivors have to tell their own though. And, they have to find that courage and strength to tell their own. So,
Yeah. I think too, one of the other things I picked up on in this story was that there was sometimes sexual abuse um, on these boys by other boys. And you have
yes.
this issue of them in an environment where abuse is being normalized. And so they would be sexually abused by their peers. And this, the authorities there
So,
were aware of it. What do you know about that piece?
yes, that's very true. So, but you have to understand that a lot of the boys were forced to commit sexual acts against the other children. Um, and y- you have to think of what would this do to a child, and it's horrible. And this is why we need to put an end to, you know, allowing these types of individuals who commit heinous crimes, these adults against children, back into society, because they reoffend and then could potentially create, depending on the way the child goes in life into their adulthood, they could potentially create this same illness in this child in their adulthood. And it's a cycle that is constantly being reborn onto this planet. So by saving and protecting children, we actually protect our future, and we're saving ourselves as a society and as humanity.
It's true. I don't think we'll ever really be able to properly track whether this created more pedophiles.
Mhm.
It is possible that I mean, 50 years is a long time to be doing this to children. So I would be shocked if it didn't produce, unfortunately, another generation of abusers on some scale. But I think this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, this assumption that children can handle more than they can handle, um, that is so pervasive in Canadian society. The whole idea, again, of the mature minors doctrine, this is what's being used to sexually transition children, to medically transition children in Canada against their parental will. The idea that children can handle this, that they can handle these kinds of decisions, they can handle these kinds of situations. And it is a total rejection of childhood innocence itself. It's a philosophical rejection that it even exists, because I think we all know, this is what always kind of drives me crazy, is that we know as adults that our decision making capacity required decades of life experience to cultivate. I mean, we
Mhm.
could get into like the neurological data on that, and it's very strong. But I just think on a fundamental level, for people to understand, as an adult, that it took you decades to understand how decision making works, what a long term decision is like, what are the implications, and to even find your morality, to find your moral compass as an adult. It takes a lot of different experiences to form that. And then it's like you said, if you have children, you have these young boys in this situation where they're either being forced to torture their cohorts, or it's become so normal to them that they develop some sort of complex to have power over others as a means of surviving. But all of this goes back to this notion that children don't have a form of vulnerability that is notable in this way. And I think, what is your understanding of that as a mother, as experiencing your children growing up and now being a grandmother, seeing these cycles play out, what does that look like to you in comparison to the legal direction Canada is moving and the way it frames childhood innocence?
It's very frightening. It's heartbreaking. And, I couldn't agree with you more. I think we as adults almost forget what it was like to be a child and how beautiful it was to be a child and how vulnerable we were and how impressionable we were. And, it really takes becoming an adult to kind of realize, whoa, the world is not as wonderful and as magical as we thought it was, right? Like, and it does take time to develop, into, who you are as an adult with full conviction, right? Like that takes time. Like even I think about things that I did in my 20s that I would never do now at my age, right? Or, like and to make such a life altering decision to, you know, to remove my my body parts, because, maybe as a child I'm slightly confused or I'm more of a tomboy or whatever, but then you have all these people saying, "Oh no, you're just, you're not in the right body. It's okay." Like it's so unbelievably insane to me. Like I can't even like you said, like people who don't see this, it's like we're not the same. We're not the same people. I don't understand how you cannot see that this is a problem, right? Especially when we see these detransitioners, when we hear of the stories of like the infections, and this is all you are part now of the medical system forever after you transition forever. It's a lifelong commitment. Do they tell you this? Like, where is we saw a lack of informed consent during COVID. I haven't been in this situation personally, but I can't imagine they're laying all of this out and what like yeah, it's another topic that is just horrific and deeply disturbing to me. And as a mother and as a grandmother, I fear for the future. I fear for our children. I fear for mothers and fathers. And I don't know what more has to happen for people to wake up and realize that they are slowly taking your children from you. And soon they will have full authority over them.
Yeah, this gradual process, I think, it's the old frog in boiling water parable, right? That it's the
Mhm.
temperature is being raised so gradually. So you have your own story of childhood abuse and waking up to that, which I'm sure has informed your position and your understanding of all this. Um, how did you come to a place of acknowledging and recognizing that and beginning the healing process? What's your story behind all of that?
Mhm. So, trauma and memory are stored in the body very differently. And during 2020, I don't know if you remember my story, Simon, but my kids went to Australia and then Australia shut down their international border. And at that moment, my whole world fell apart. I didn't know if or when I was going to see my children again, right? Which none of us knew what was going to happen, but they were shutting down the world. And so, but for the first time I had my kids up until they were 12 and 14. I was alone, completely alone and isolated because of lockdowns. And I started to remember things, and it was very scary at that time. I had called my mom because this was my grandfather on my mother's side. And we all know that he was very, very physically abusive to his children. He beat um, his oldest son so badly that like he had to go to the hospital. His shoulder was coming, his bone was coming out. Like it was so horrible abuses. And you have to understand, my grandfather was a very well recognized and revered person in the community in Toronto. He owned an art gallery on Queen Street. He painted Portuguese politicians, and he was awarded the title of Commendador, which is very similar to what, the United Kingdom gave to Sir Elton John, that title. Um, and so, anyways, I was starting to, get these memories, and I called my mom and I was just kind of breaking down to her. And she told me that another member of the family has been wanting to try to reach out to talk to my mom. And I said, you need to, and she said, I think this is what it's about. And I said, you need to talk to her. You need to go now and talk to her. And then she came forward, which meant the world to me. So we talked, and it was difficult, but my parents then thought I needed to, I was really breaking down at that point with, my children being away and, being alone and isolated. So they wanted me to go out to a, trauma center, basically. Um, I went for a little bit, but it was just a week because at that time I didn't feel like it was geared towards what I was going through, like sexual abuse. It was more for other things, and it wasn't helping in my situation. And I was still at that time, my heart was fighting this in the movement. And so I had to come back and fight what I was doing. And I couldn't be away for 30 years days or whatever. So basically that's, what happened. And it happened to me. I was very young. It occurred while I was older as well. But I, you know, I did talk, I haven't been like really doing much. I didn't really do much back then other than the trauma center, but until recently, I've been speaking with somebody and just her kind of empowering me to tell my story and to get it out of my body, right? To get it
Yeah.
out. It needs to come out because it's being stored in here, and it has been for so long. And that's come out a lot of, when I look back on how I, behaved in my past, it makes sense, right? Because traumatized children become traumatized adults, and you know, you some of us go to ways to suppress um the pain. And, I've told my entire family, aunts, cousins, everybody, that I'm sharing my story. I'm not going to hide. I'm not going to stay silent. We can't live in denial. We can't, I think a lot of it has to do with like image too. And there's a lot of shame around it as well, right? So because of how he was high profile, you know, and their family was well known, they didn't know about these abuses or sexual abuses that occurred. And so they just kind of want to like, no, let's leave it there and, not acknowledge it, and let's just move forward. Whereas, it will always be there if you don't acknowledge it. And, so that's
Yes.
what I'm doing.
This brings up a lot of things. I've researched this, the process by which memories are compartmentalized when there is trauma. There's a lot of strange controversy around this, and oddly, some of it ties back to some of the mind control things. There's some denial in some mainstream media denial, some mainstream medical denial that we compartmentalize traumatic memories this way. And there's been a lot of effort put into denying that this happens. So, for example, you have this term called false memory syndrome. And there was a whole false memory syndrome organization set up. Um, Not surprisingly, the board members were composed of CIA members, but they put forward this whole narrative that people suffer from false memory syndrome when they claim to be retrieving abusive memories from their childhood that they had previously repressed. And I even know that the CBC has helped propagate this myth. They have documentaries on survivors of ritual abuse who stand by their story to this day. And the CBC in these modern documentaries are still claiming that these grown adults who remember perfectly their abuse are suffering from false memory syndrome because there is this systematic denial that abused children compartmentalize those experiences as a natural means of surviving. And I mean, it ties into this broader issue of not really acknowledging the nature of innocence, of what happens to a child. What is the fracturing of a child? What do we do when we're abused, when we encounter situations that are too horrific for us to comprehend as a child? And, it makes me think of the Robert Land Academy case in a lot of ways, that I wonder how many adults are actually out there, maybe still today, who might have even compartmentalized some of what they experienced there, who might not have even accessed those memories yet. And it sort of, to
Yeah.
me, it adds another layer of,
Yeah.
difficulty to this whole case.
Yeah. It 100%. And I think that's why so many survivors don't come forward because they're afraid that they're not going to be believed or that, they're going to side with the abuser, which many people do, right? Like mothers of when their own children come to them and say, this has happened, will still stay with the abuser, the father, the stepfather. Like there's just this it's so there's both of that, right? Like siding with the abuser and then not believing the accuser. And so that's why I feel like so many people are afraid to come forward, but by other survivors coming forward with their stories and sharing their stories, it will empower others to do so, right? Um, but yeah, I think it's just, and then it's like they're trying so hard to hide this, like to just cover it up, put it in a box, put it away, and just like, don't look at this, right? And then you have this, you know, desensitizing that's occurring, and then this normalization that's occurring, and then oh well, now we're going to have empathy for these predators and call them minor attracted persons because that's more politically correct than calling them a pedophile. And let's try to like reintegrate them into society even though they've committed just such heinous acts. Like it's all these different layers. And it's like, no, this is where people need to stand in their power and parents need to stand in their authority. And we need to, it's really, I think, the parents that are the ones that are going to have to fight this battle.
Yeah, I think that's a
I
really
mean,
important point. It's huge.
yeah. I mean, there's many, like in Moms Resist, my organization, we have a lot of people who don't have children. So it's not just, like this is a moral thing. This is not a left or right thing. This is a moral thing. And when you see them, the chipping away of like values in society and morals in society and stripping children of their innocence, like that's when people who have a heart and a soul are like, no, we see what you're doing and we are taking a stand. And that's why there's just been this flame that's been ignited because I think now with the release of the Epstein files, people can feel like they've been validated. And it's really been empowering for people.
Well, I think focusing on the empowerment piece is really important when you're dealing with this much darkness. And I think that's one of the things that I find most uplifting about this, that while we do have the legal battles and we do need to get in place these laws that better protect children, the most powerful thing that can be done is that children are better guarded by their parents, that parents take more of a role in their child's life. Even to me, as someone who's we're unschooling families, so our children are with us pretty much all the time. Um, just keeping them close, you know, that to us seemed like this is how you defend their innocence. You
Mhm.
just stay with them. You raise them yourself, you educate them yourself. And understanding that, getting a sense of that has given me deep insight into all the ways in which innocence is under threat in our society. Having to, encounter people in situations in my own community that were obviously so dangerous for my children. But I think this is a part of the hope that parents who decide to take control by homeschooling, by keeping their children more close, by more deeply relating to them, this is one of the biggest, I think, acts that can be taken, and one of the major ways that children can be defended, because a lot of the ways that predators are getting access to children is because they are getting to know them and are manipulating them, especially with the online abuse. And I
Yes.
honestly think that a lot of parents would be able to protect their children better if they had deeper relationships with the children themselves. And just the way that our society has normalized, for example, children being away all day at school and all of that in their most formative years, to me, there's like a longer game that's been played in giving children up to the state. And I think the good news is that you can bring your children closer, you can raise them yourself, you can take action on their education. And that is a huge first line of defense in my experience. I'm seeing a lot of that, a lot of parents taking control of their children's education as one way of protecting them more deeply, from
Mhm.
what's going
I
on.
think that's so important. I think it's so important to keep your children home if you can. Unfortunately, not all parents can, and that's the problem. But you're seeing that, yeah, like we talk about the state taking over. Well, like the boys, for example, that fled Robert Land, they were returned by the police back to the school. We're seeing incidents of CAS getting involved, even when it comes to like medical intervention, like some parents who refusing vaccines or, certain things, we've seen CAS come in. Parents that have, do not agree with the whole transitioning issue. We've seen there's some stories of parents being removed from their children's lives for that. And so again, like red flags, slippery slope, please wake up, because the more we allow these things to happen, the more control they will gain, and the more power they will gain over our children, and removing us from the nuclear family from that equation and putting them and interjecting themselves.
Yeah, it's really important for people to understand all the different ways that the concept of the nuclear family is being eroded. I think, it's something that I've studied a lot. It's why I find the Marxist piece so intriguing. For example, in the classroom now, many schools in Canada are being asked to stop using the words mother and father. And I more recently saw them requesting that they stop using the words brother and sister because they're too gender normative. And so all the normal concepts of the nuclear family are actually being excluded from the classroom systematically. And people have a hard time, I think, piecing it all together. It's that frog in boiling water scenario where maybe isolated, some progressively minded parents could say, okay, I see how that's helping children who come from differently styled families, isolated, maybe you could maybe make an argument. I would still argue against it, but it's when it all functions together, what the sum total of all these tiny little changes are. It's like a death by 1,000 cuts.
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
and so we have to be
There's
able to take on these battles one by one. So if we're looking at this particular battle, let's say with the Robert Land case, this really highlights that, especially in Ontario seems to be the worst province for this. As far as I can tell, Ontario has the worst gap in protecting children in private schools. Now, the argument from the conservative side is that the whole point of these private institutions is to give children or to give families alternative institutions to educate their children that are outside of government control. And they're claiming that, this would undermine that whole idea that you can have institutions that are free of government control. So What do you say to the arguments coming from, the progressive conservative side of things that they're trying to create institutions that are government free for the families?
I would just say that they don't care about the protection of children, period. Because it is so simple to, by ministerial order, change this, that anybody who is looking after children, teaching children, have a criminal background check. Do they agree that convicted criminals should be teaching children? Because that's all I can come up with, that they do agree that criminals should be allowed to teach children.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I mean, this should be any politician should, I would think, would agree that, yeah, we shouldn't have convicted criminals teaching innocent, vulnerable children. But this is where it's like, what's happened in this country? Are we that lost? And it just makes me feel like this has to be deliberate. They can't be that stupid. Like, you can't be that dumb. You've seen this horrific story come out. If a teacher in the public school system broke a boy's legs and was a convicted criminal, do you not think there would be outrage among parents? Unfortunately, there's no outrage over this story and this boy because it's been so sheltered.
Yeah.
It's so hidden.
Yeah.
And so my question to any politician who thinks this, is about giving freedom to, or alternative, methods to schooling, is why can you not have alternative methods with demanding that there be criminal background checks for the teachers and staff who are around our most vulnerable?
Yeah. It seems simple. God, it seems simple. And then you're right. I mean, we have so many different things going on in this country that you either have someone who maybe they are personally invested in the harming of children, or maybe they're just selfish in a way where they're caught up in this and they're only self-serving. And if it doesn't serve them, they really don't take action on it. But you also have people who are totally ideologically captured, who may
Yeah.
have this very sort of neo-Marxist mentality about the child's rights and all this twisted stuff. This, to me, is why we have organizations like the Canadian Pediatric Society, who are involved, to me, in the largest child abuse scandal in history. I think, sex changes for children is one of the most horrific child abuse scandals. But this is an organization that is promoting this against all the evidence around the world. So, I only bring that up to say that we have all these different ways that I think people have been captured so that they're just not in service of the children. And it's made
Mhm.
it this kind of tangled web now where either someone is a pedophile or they're so ideologically captured that they cannot see the harm to children. So, for example, there was a case out in BC where, a mother had transitioned her child, and the child was regularly doing like sexualized dances for adults at like a bar and being given money. This was a minor and was
Mhm.
dancing for adults, like basically like a sort of striptease drag show. And to the mom, even after being approached, even after this story broke, the mom still took the position that she was supporting her child's gender identity and gender expression and could not see, really genuinely. And I think, this is I think it speaks to the kind of warfare, because to me, I frame a lot of this
Yeah.
as warfare, as psychological warfare, as ideological
Psychological
subversion.
warfare.
It
Yeah.
is. And I think that's important for people to understand, because psychological warfare affects people at the level of cognition. And when you're dealing with cognition, you're dealing with people's perception. And if the way we perceive the world, if the way we perceive children can be altered, then you get these strange scenarios where someone who believes they are acting in the defense of children is actually part of abusing them.
Hmm. Hmm. We will fall as a society if we fail to protect the children, and that is the direction and the trajectory that we're heading towards. Once children are no longer deemed as innocent or worth protecting, it's anarchy. We fall. Society falls. We are just like, we're no longer human. What are we?
Yeah.
People have to recognize that this is a war on our children. And I know this sounds like, maybe to some that war seems like, um, big word
Or
uh,
hyperbole. They call it
yeah,
hyperbole.
yeah, but it is a war on our children, and people need to see it for what it is. And you're absolutely right, Simon. People have been captured. This is a psychological war, and people need to start to wake up. And that is what we've been trying to do. And my hope is that with what this movement has stirred and has ignited in people is that we can try to bring them back and wake them up when it comes to what is actually being done to children. The problem is it's been this progression of this normalization and this sexualization and this desensitization that we're really having to, it's so deep. Like they're just I can't understand it. And I mean, I just thank God every day that as difficult as it is, as you know, to be in this position and to see what's actually happening, that I see it. And
Yeah.
if I see it, I can do something about it. And this is where we need to stop living in this fear and start living in our power. And they've tried to attack us, those of us who have been speaking out and fighting, you, myself, because it's Marxism, right? Marxism, like it's the opposite. They flip it on its head. So if we oppose, children being transitioned or giving hormones or puberty blockers or being sexualized, they say that we're not inclusive, right? This is all under the guise of inclusivity. And if we don't think like them, we are bad people. We are bigots. We are hateful. We are, racists. We've been called everything in the book, Nazis, when we tried to defend our bodily autonomy in Ottawa. And it's awful how we are attacked. But, I think we've also been learning throughout this process how to approach this. And it's been a war that we've had to kind of navigate and learn, what works, what doesn't. And we all need to really get on our feet right now. And I can't express enough how crucial it is to stand on your feet now, right now.
Well, I mean, Canada is facing this era of deep, deep political division. And, I think it's a kind of political division that debilitates a nation because it's a level of political division that makes genuine discussions very, very difficult, very
Mhm.
hard for the left and the right to have real, meaningful conversations, genuine debates that um, that involve people acknowledging a differing view and holding space for another person to actually disagree with them. And I think that's one of the big losses. But I also believe that the children might be the one thing that can fracture that. It might be the one thing that can cross that divide. And I think there is some
It,
hope there. That's what I see.
it absolutely is, Simon. It is. We by saving the children, we save ourselves, you know? Um, it's even, Michael Jackson's song, We're Saving Our Own Lives, right? Like, and this is the tipping point. We must protect them at all costs. And I just hope that everybody out there listening or watching, somehow this is getting to your heart and your soul. And we need to get to the hearts of others, right? I think their minds are kind of gone. So how do we get to their hearts? Um, and, all of us need to start, you know, taking to the streets, speaking, talking, not being afraid to use our voice. Do not stay silent. Do not stay quiet. People, I think, need to start pulling their children out of the school system. Like there needs to be um, purposeful steps taken to prove and to show the government that we are not playing your game anymore, and pull the power back. We the people have the power. It lies with us, not with them.
So we're now at this point where, you've been in touch with an MP. They're in a position now to push forward to try to get some legal changes here that force private schools and these alternative education systems to have background checks on everyone who is guiding a child. So where are you at in that process? What are the next steps? What do you see needing to happen to actually get this into law?
Mhm. So I am, you know, have become quite close with Stefanos Karatopoulos. He's a very smart guy. Obviously, he's a survivor, and they are working the survivors of Robert Land are working really hard to get that pushed through by ministerial order. I met recently with the staff for Fred Davies, who's a conservative member of parliament. Fred Davies is the one who is supporting the petition. So it's his petition. And he is in agreement that there should be no early release for sexual predators or bail, as well as making the National Sex Offender Registry public. I think last check, and the petition is on our website, momsresist.ca. Last I checked, it's close to 1,900 signatures. It was at about 1,200 signatures on March 7th before we did the march and before we really started to, get this out on multiple social media platforms, and everybody is just sharing it out. But the fact that it's only gone up, about 700 signatures, it's we had speed cameras removed because of the petition to remove speed cameras here in Ontario. If we can have speed cameras removed and people cared enough about that, I think we should have a million times more signing this petition. The problem is we're very censored. We're very shadow banned on our social media pages. So it's breaking the matrix and trying to get this out there. Um, so, I am just asking everybody to, protect children, protect our most vulnerable. We cannot allow these predators back into the neighborhoods and communities where children are. There is a 1 in 4 reoffend rate, and your child is at risk. All of our children are at risk.
So you have an event coming up that is going to be downtown Toronto to help bring awareness to this. Do you want to give us a little more information on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the original demonstration of Save Our Children took place on March 7th, and it was almost 100 cities across North America that stood in solidarity. And the goal is to end child exploitation and child trafficking. And it was very successful. This is a movement that's growing. It's ignited a flame, and everybody is showing that they are interested and that they care and they want to get involved. I think because we know how by saving our children, we can actually win this war. And this is how we do it, right? So, Scotty decided that he would do another one again on April 11th. And now we're just a little more organized, a lot more momentum, a lot more people involved, a lot more initiatives and people taking action. And it's just growing. And I think it speaks to the hearts of so many who see the crisis that we're in right now and the war against our children.
Yeah, I think, there's an important piece here in terms of gathering in person, getting offline, getting together in person, having conversations offline, in person. To me, that's been a big part of this. I think stepping outside of the warfare, outside of a lot of the influence, just has to do with coming together and meeting in person and gathering in the physical domain. There's
Mm.
a lot of power in that. And I think it's very, very different than gathering online. I think people need to understand the benefit of that. And I think sometimes people are a little exhausted by the sort of outrage machine online. People see so much horrific content, so much that says, oh my God, be outraged, like it's horrible, be outraged. And this, to an extent, I think has caused a lot of people to draw back. They're sort of paralyzed, by just the amount of outrageous insanity they see online. Um, so I've personally found it very nourishing to try to attend the in-person events, to try to have those one-on-one conversations in person. Um, because being in the presence of other people, I found it really mitigates that exhaustion that comes from the online outrage machine. And so I
Yeah.
think it's important to distinguish, those two things in terms of why it's meaningful to gather like this.
Yeah, it is very meaningful and it's healing, right? I think like we are so isolated and just, we live in this rat race of a society and then we are just glued to our phones and everything, even so many things have changed in terms of like going shopping where, everything can come to your door. It's all on your phones. And then you're like immersed in this. And a lot of this is really dark and heavy. And you don't really have a community or a safe space to talk about it and get it out of your, body. And so these marches are, yes, not only finding your community, but it's very empowering as well, I think. And so it is important for all of us to come together and take a stand and continue to grow this and network and get connected to people and get connected to survivors. Like, having been the other day when we went out into that sexual predator's neighborhood and meeting the survivors and understanding why they're doing this as a fellow survivor empowered me to publicly tell my story, which I've never really done. And I've been keeping that inside of me. And do you know how much of a release that was for me? Like, I've obviously my family members know, friends know, and that sort of thing, my therapist, but to actually get it out publicly and not feel shame and to feel supported and loved was such a healing experience for me. So I think it is really important that we do connect and find each other and continue to network and expose these horrors that are happening. But then at the same time, you know, we we kind of have this um, sisterhood and brotherhood that, um, keeps us going, right?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think it's a matter of survival in my experience, surviving just the weight of all of this. Okay, so people in the GTA, they can come out and support on April 11th. I was wondering, is there a way
Yeah.
to support the survivors of Robert Land Academy to help get their work or anything they're doing online supported? Or are they maintaining more of a private community that's taking action on its own?
I think they are maintaining more of a private community, that they are definitely taking action. There's a ton of lawsuits, and I mean they've been exposing this. They exposed it at the press conference in Ottawa. There is stuff out there, but I can definitely reach out to Stefanos and see if there is other ways or methods or even financially if there's a way that we can support them in what they're doing
Hmm.
for sure. Um, yeah, but I'm not sure of like a specific like,
Yeah,
GoFundMe or anything like that. They've
yeah.
got lawyers already. They've got like they're quite established and they're quite far in where they're at with what they're doing.
No, I'm really glad to hear that. And I think, that victory, I think, will lead to a lot more exposure of this story. I personally, I'm hoping that I can get a lot more exposure on it and maybe produce a lot more content on it because I just think it's sprawling. I think the implications of this are sprawling, and I think it's really outside the understanding that people have of what has been allowed in Canada. Probably a lot. This is just one institution that's been exposed. There's
Mhm.
lots, I'm sure, where this has just gone on and it's never been exposed because as this story indicates, people just become broken adults and it never gets out there and their story never gets told. That can be very common. So I think it's really important to use the Robert Land Academy case as a real case study into what we need to change in our society. I think it's so important. Is there any, for those who can't attend on April 11th, what can they do in terms of supporting Moms Resist?
Yeah, so first thing they can do is go to mumsresist.ca and sign the petition. It is, you go to the website, it's right up at the top. You click on, sign the petition, fill out your information, and then you will get a confirmation, like an email to verify uh, yourself, and you complete that. It's about a 1 minute process. It's very simple. Takes 1 minute. And this could lead to potentially saving thousands of lives, right? So that's one thing. If you want to get involved with initiatives and volunteering and that sort of thing, you can also go to our website, mumsresist.ca, fill out your information, and we'll get connected and, kind of provide you with emails and information and initiatives that we're working on. But a lot of our future initiatives are on the website as well. We are asking that on May 15th, 2026, 10 a.m. in St. Catharines at the St. Catharines Courthouse, Jonathan Jeffrey Alstead will be in court for his pre-sentencing hearing. This is another way you can actually support the boys of Robert Land Academy, because not only did he teach at Robert Land Academy and abuse boys there, but he's committed sexual abuse and child exploitation to children outside of Robert Land as well. So he will be in court this day, and we are just asking that the public fill up the courtroom and show the judge that there is public interest, that there are people who care about this case and what the end result of this case will be, to show this monster no leniency, because our laws are atrocious in Canada. And I've heard some of the most horrific stories of crimes committed against children, 3-year-olds, and they get a few years, right? It sometimes not even a year, and then they're put back into the neighborhoods. It's beyond comprehension, Simon, when you really understand the full picture and the scope, right, of how much leniency there is for people who commit, in my opinion, the worst of the worst crime. I think they should be met with the harshest penalties.
Yeah. Okay, so this is the trial on the 13th. Now he's being
The
tried
15th,
for the what's that?
May 15th.
May 15th. Now this is the case where he was caught luring what he thought were teenagers into sexual encounters, and they were actual police officers.
No, he lured actual children.
Oh no, I just mean the way that he was caught. This is
Yes,
just
that's how he was caught. Yes, sorry, that's how he was caught. Yes.
yes, and then that they uncovered that he had been abusing children and all of this. And so this is the case outside of Robert Land Academy, but there's the hope that our response to this case where this teacher is being caught can bring more light to the survivors and their story and their push for justice.
Exactly. There are a couple of the survivors from Robert Land that live outside of Ontario that are flying in specifically for this case.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is
Okay.
how much it means to these boys. And I mean, it should mean so much to everybody. Once, like, I sat in the courtroom on Wednesday, and what I heard is like a parent's worst nightmare. It's something that it is, it's something you would hear of or see in horror movies. And I can't say anything of what was spoken about because of the publication ban. But what I can say is he pled guilty to all 4 counts, because that's been made public now. A couple newspapers have reported on that, which he pled guilty on Wednesday.
Well, based on the conversation we've had today, I think it's fair to use the framing that we're dealing with one of these people who's morally inverted, who sought
Mhm.
to destroy innocence, to cause suffering in the vulnerable for himself, and did it regularly. And I think, you know, it's really, really important for people to, I think, calmly, outside of their addiction to the outrage machine, digitally, to really calmly get a sense of what is going on here locally. So I think that's really important. I'm glad to hear that people can actually show up at the courtroom and support that. Um,
Mhm.
where can people support your journalism, follow you, follow your work?
hmm So, my journalism, it's mostly just on Instagram. So it's independent underscore journalism underscore. I haven't been doing so much journalism lately. I'm really focused on Moms Resist, my organization,
Yeah.
and creating awareness, demanding change, and protecting children. That's our goal and our mission. And so I have been, just really focused on that and, still exposing, stories like Robert Land and other cases here in Canada. But, just, I think people can support the most by going to mumsresist.ca and seeing how you can get involved, signing the petition and helping us in our future initiatives. And our key objectives are listed there. So removing the strict criteria around the Amber Alert system, amending laws because we believe that sexual predators should be met with the harshest penalties, obviously making the National Sex Offender Registry public, making it that criminal background checks are mandatory in private schools when it comes to people looking after children and also having, holding a license, being a licensed teacher, and as well as that anyone found with one of our missing children here in Canada be charged as a child trafficker, human trafficker.
Okay. All right. That's excellent to know. Well, what I'd like to do is, keep in touch, especially with all of these issues, whatever there is progress wise, any movement on the Robert, Land case, any of these, I think it'd be good to keep in touch, and, maybe we can have another conversation soon to keep people up to date on all of this.
Sure, Simon. And I know that Stefanos would be more than happy to sit down with you.
Yeah.
So another way in which you can support is getting their story out, and that would be something that if you could do, I know he'd appreciate that.
Yeah. Put me in touch. Absolutely.
I will. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you so much.